decision to do this project specifically was made rather selfishly, as the individualist nature of this subject would encourage, and based on that I'd always wanted to produce an album and wanted the experience as a recording engineer and mixer. Of course, the project went a bit beyond that, having to sort out bookings, artwork, CD pressings, and working on the 2 music videos that were supposed to come out in the weeks following the album's release. Overall, I think the project has been a success, album sales notwithstanding, considering the volume and quality of work put in. The aim has been to capture the melancholy and whimsical themes of the Moccasins with a lo-fi musical aesthetic and to release that out into the world. Though this aim has been met, I do have some thoughts. The best gift you can give to a project is to know what you're doing. Myself being more experienced as a graphic artist, I set about a lot of research into album production with similar sonic aesthetics as I'd been going for, especially considering research was the first assessment. That being said, critically listening to albums, reading Kurt Cobain and Steve Albini's correspondence, whilst watching Tony Visconti interviews and keynotes will only get you so far. Readings are no substitute for experience, but they will give you an idea of what to expect and how to go about whatever project you've set about. Arguably, these readings were the most useful thing I could have done for the album, and even though there are parts that I'm not so fond of, the result is sufficient to make this research worthy of ritualization. Perhaps the most major shortcoming with the recording was that we began the process before the readings were totally complete, which could have meant that they weren't as effective as they could have been. That being said, the only real technical issue with the recordings was that the mic gain on the snare was set a bit high during one section, which meant a bit of sampling had to be done to correct this. The main intent with recording was to capture all of the rhythmic elements live in the room as a band playing live, with minimal overdubs reserved for vocals and more melodic guitar passages, in order to emulate a more 70s vintage style recording process. This experiment proved different for the most part. Due to some scheduling issues, a few parts had to be overdubbed later on while thinking about the time constraints. In addition, often I found I didn't like some of the guitar parts that were recorded on the day during the sessions, just considering we do have something of an improvisational nature, so a good portion of the sounds were also overdubbed. Again, in addition, some bass parts were added on later on, some lower down, more bassy parts were dubbed in order to thicken certain sections of certain songs. Despite all the unexpected overdubbing, we still ended up with an aesthetic that pretty well reflected our live sound at the time and the overall aesthetic of the album we were going for, which was, of course, the main aim of recording. Overall, this has taught me to not be afraid of using a conventional recording process for a band such as the Moccasins, and I've kept that in my mind for perpetuity. Thanks to experience with playing live, and again the readings, overall I've had a pretty good idea of what frequencies and what instruments should sit at whatever point in the mixes. As before, there really is only so much that reading about these things can help with. The challenge with mixing such a quantity of songs is finding a way to make them all pretty consistent with each other, especially considering the recordings were not all done in the one session. My solution to this was to take one song that in my opinion was exemplary of the sound that we were going for, and to make that song sound as good as possible without additional recordings. I spent about 2 weeks with this song and a couple of others building a series of presets that I could use on plugins for every song and adjust them as necessary in order to cater for all the different days and different sounds. What I think the issue with this solution was that the exemplar song sounds better than the rest of the mixes, which I think is a natural result of spending 2 weeks focused mainly on that. I'm not going to say what song it was because, in my opinion, it's pretty obvious which one it is. I would have loved to have spent the same amount of time on each song, but unfortunately a free 8 weeks is a hard thing to come by. The visual side of this assessment has been plagued with issues, but the most important part has been achieved to a high and characteristic style. The point of the artwork has been to reflect the musical style of the band, and I think this was a pretty successful venture. It's cheeky, retro-styled, and perhaps a little bit self-indulgent, which I guess is the whole point. Throughout the process, 2 music videos were conceptualized and went into production, but only one came out in the end. While I'd still like to put out this second one, I don't think it's really worth doing at this point, as the album's life seems to be effectively over, and it wouldn't be a productive use of my time. If I think about this, what could have been done to allow myself to complete this whole thing would be to allow more time in the production cycle for the production of such a music video, considering just how little time I actually had to spare given the production of the album itself, production of CDs, and trying to deal with my own residential situation at the time. One thing that would definitely alleviate this time management issue would be to allow other people to come in and help work on these things, which I definitely will do in the future. I've even got some people in mind who I would not mind working with. For the most part, release was the easiest part of this project, considering a lot of the framework for an online release through Bandcamp was already there, and the CD pressings can be outsourced to a company for a price. Of course, we've still got an online release via streaming services such as Spotify and eventually iTunes on the cards, but that's going to be another month or so as I set about starting up my own record label. The booking side of this was, again, relatively easy, considering much of this was left to give me a bass player. I was only involved in booking so much as arranging a date and a venue. I will endeavour to maintain such a relationship, considering how efficient and helpful this was. I suppose that's why booking agencies continue to exist. I think the main thing that could have been improved for the launch event was hype. We released the album on the day, which doesn't allow for a lot of exposure and growth before the event. Of course, we couldn't really delay it all that much considering Andrew's departure from both band and country the following week, but the thought remains. Otherwise, having a readily disposable mascot for a cheeky bit of stagecraft would have been a nice touch. For the titular cat, Andrew brought in an heirloom of his, which I would have loved to have got bouncing around in the crowd, but that would have been impolite. It wasn't a premeditated feature, but I wish it were so that we could have exploited the imagery. Again, the thought remains. Looking back on the process, there are so many things I would have done differently, but without the process I wouldn't have the experience to know I'd do them differently. I think after the artistic success of this album, I'll be looking at something of a textural and lineup change to grow artistically to accommodate a new, even more avant-garde direction. Life in the shadow of Juicy has been good for growth and a very good learning experience. Until next time.